Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Paris Aslanidis, a lecturer in Hellenic studies and political science. His current research interests include social movements, populism, Greek politics, and methods of text analysis. Today, we'll talk with Professor Aslanidis about populism and social movements. Welcome, Professor Aslanidis.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Yes, so populism, let's define that as a term.
Right. So I should have a ready answer for that, and I do, but you have to know that there's a long controversy over the meaning of the term. So I define it as a type of anti-establishment discourse in the name of the people, right? Which means that there's a politician or a social movement that has this rhetoric that idolizes the people and claims that the elites, or some form of elite, is responsible for the grievances of the people. And the legitimizing force behind their argument is the notion of, or the value of popular sovereignty, right? So the people feel that in every society, its members should be the ones taking decisions and on how they govern themselves, right? And when this element of popular sovereignty is somehow undermined by a powerful force out there, the so-called elites, then they're justified to rebel against what is going on and claim back sovereignty into their own hands, right?
Okay.
That doesn't leave so much space for normative considerations yet on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, which is, the way most people would approach the topic. I see that as a second-level question, and we can, of course, discuss it. But in terms of, as we say, seizing the object and identifying, if you want to put it simply, who is a populist and who is not a populist, I tend to look at what they say, at what the discourse of the movement or the party is, and identify whether they employ this distinction between people and elites as their dominant theme, right? There are, of course, other views out there. Others would associate populism with specific policies, for instance, economic policies. This is the dominant view amongst economists, for instance. Others would see populism as having to do with undermining liberal democracy, right, and its institutions. Others see it as a strategy that there are savvy politicians out there. They know this works and they use it cynically in order to attract voters. So there's a constellation of different views out there.
Yes.
One of them, the group of thought which I subscribe to, is the one that sees populism as a discourse.
Okay. So let me ask you this. What drew you to be interested in populism?
Right.
You are Greek, yes?
Yes, I am.
And I know you've looked at populism in Greece. I mean, is that part of it or is it something else?
Great question. So back in 2011, when I started my PhD, we had this social movement in Greece. Remember, Greece was in the midst of the crisis in 2011, right? And everybody was out in the streets protesting against the bailout agreements and austerity and so on and so forth. So we had this movement that did mobilize this feeling of we are the people here, and some guys up there who we do not like are trying to defraud us of our sovereignty, right? And my academic mentor back then thought it would be a great idea to study populism in the form of a social movement, which was, because this is what we were experiencing back then, right?
Right.
So it was political developments that actually led me to the topic, and I haven't regretted it, to be honest, because I managed to study populism both as a form of party politics, but also at the grassroots. And I have actually specialized in the grassroots aspect because there are many scholars who have employed the term populism in social movement studies, and that's the ground I'm trying to break.
How do you look at populism at that level? I mean, what are you looking at? Facebook, what kinds of things?
Social media is a good way. Of course, populism didn't begin, in the era of social media. We had populist social movements before that. So you usually follow the paper trail of the movement. It could be manifestos of the movement. It could be interviews with its activists. Could be flyers or banners, right? In general, you're trying to figure out the collective identity of the movement. Who's we in the movement? If you ask them, who are you? Why are you out there in the street as a group? What is this group all about?
Right.
And who are you against? So what's your grievance and who do you direct it against? And you get answers along the lines of, we are the people, and we are protesting against bankers or businessmen, or it could be academics, of course. The elite group has different types of connotations around the world, and we're protesting against, the inordinate power over us. Then you're on track to be able to label that a populist movement, right?
Right.
The specific grievances differ. The specific elites against whom these grievances are directed also differ. For instance, I would claim that both the Tea Party was a populist movement here in the States, again during the crisis, and Occupy Wall Street, right? Some people have trouble associating the label with both movements. That has to do, of course, with your normative understanding of the whole concept. Right? I try to be as objective as I can and just employ my work as a tool of identification, and then I work my way from there.
I see. I'm curious to know your thoughts about how populism develops in a country. We can talk about Greece, of course. I'm also interested in your thoughts about the United States. You've been in the United States here at Yale for the past 3 years or so with the new president coming into power. I'm interested in your thoughts about particularly the United States and populism, and is it growing in your opinion? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems to be.
Right. So for many academics, the US is one of the most fascinating cases when it comes to populism, and it has been since its founding, more or less. Many would tell you that the US was founded as a populist republic up to a point, because the notion of popular sovereignty is very strong in this country, right? The fact that it rebelled against monarchy, right?
Right.
Has infused the population with values of we the people that are very strong, and this creates an undercurrent of potential mobilization throughout the decades. So it's the same with every other country out there in the world where its population feels entitled to claim that power should be in their hands, right? So whenever a certain part of the population feels that this is not happening for X or Y reason, they might be right, they might be wrong, right? So if they feel that somebody is trying to defraud them of their power, there's always an element of opportunity for political entrepreneurs to mobilize that feeling, right? It could be a leader, as in the case of Donald Trump, who portrays himself as an outsider of the political system. That helps, right? If you're part of the elite, or if you're part of the establishment, it's difficult to mobilize these feelings.
But in that instance, it's curious to me, because while he claims to be an outsider of politics, he still is a very wealthy white man, which is really outside of the norm for the majority of this country. So that fascinates me.
Yeah, he's not the first to do that. We've had Berlusconi in the past in Italy. It was a similar case. We've had cases in Central Europe. So it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. What matters is how you manage to sell that, right? So Trump manages to sell that outsider persona of his with another important pillar, especially for American politics, which is being a successful businessman, because he knows how things actually work out there. He has made money, so he can prove that he knows how things work, which is, which contrasts with how politicians understand the world. They know, because they know nothing about how businesses actually work, and I'm the one who will, manage to produce growth for this country, right? So even though he's very wealthy, he has managed to use that as an element of his outsider status rather than being a disadvantage for him.
Right.
So this has to do with the bigger notion of constructivism in politics, right? It's not only about who you actually are or what actually your policies are. Political communication plays a large part in the whole story. So I guess he was successful in selling a story that worked.
Right, right. I'm curious also your thoughts on, again, how populism develops in countries. And I think, do you think that fear plays a role in how populism develops, and particularly with what is going on pretty much all around the world with immigration and having new people come into your country that you might not be comfortable with? How do you see that playing?
Right. Xenophobia and populism, or nationalism and populism, that's a very difficult topic. There's some conflation between the terms here, and it depends on which part of the world you're coming from. Your experience with populism in power, in politics in general, more or less conditions the way you see the term. So if you're a Latin American, xenophobia or nativism has nothing to do with populism. Populist leaders in Latin America have traditionally been left-wing, and nativism played no part in their political success.
Okay.
If you come from Europe, Western Europe particularly, most populist parties tend to be on the right or on the radical right, and immigration, especially in the past 30 years, has become an important issue. So populism and xenophobia are two completely different things. They don't have to be together in order for a populist politician to emerge. But of course, you have many cases of politicians who employ both populism on the one hand and xenophobia on the other. So they manage to trigger different values out there in the population, or different attitudes. One of them could be the notion that they're losing power as citizens. The other one could be that part of that is the fact that our country is allowing all these illegal immigrants to come in and take our jobs, for instance, right? There are two different aspects. So there's a lot of talk about populism rising lately. But I would say that populism is a small part of what is going on. Most of it, especially in the West, has to do with nativism rather than populism rising to the forefront of politics. And sometimes it's good to be precise in how we use these terms, because if we assign everything to populism, then there might be another danger out there that's even more important, and we're losing sight of it, right?
Right.
So I wouldn't be ready to concede nativism to populism. You can have populist movements or parties that have nothing to do with nativism. But of course, it's a large part of what's going on out there.
Right, okay. And do you think populism will continue to grow throughout the world, or do you think perhaps not? What are your thoughts there?
Right. That's a great question. So populism comes in waves throughout history.
And what, before, I'll stop you there, and why? Why do you think that is?
Because the people cannot be mobilized every year to feel like they're losing power, right? There has to be a trigger, there has to be an agent who successfully constructs a story. We tend to look at successful cases of populist politicians, but there are so many unsuccessful instances, right? Politicians are trying to mobilize this feeling every month or in every campaign, but they don't always manage to do that, right? Or they do that with little success. So the big story is when somebody manages to use populism as a dominant theme in their campaign, right? And this cannot happen in every campaign. It can happen every 20 years or 30 years or 15 years. It has to do with the economy and how the economy is faring, right? Why do these people feel weak, or do they feel fear, right? Is it because there has been a great recession? Remember the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, they both emerged during the Great Recession. So for some people, there's this notion of the losers of globalization or industrialization in the past,
Sure.
right? So whenever there's a part of the population that, for X or Y reasons, feels that they're not legitimate, they are not seen as legitimate members of the country, of the society that they helped build, then they will be more, let's say, vulnerable to the populist argument. Right? So this is why it keeps coming up every now and then. I think it's always going to keep coming up. As a famous scholar of populism, Margaret Conovan, put it in the past, populism is kind of like a shadow of democracy, right? So it helps the church keep going, right? Because if we take away this notion of popular sovereignty from the whole notion of democracy, then we're left with a very dry concept, which is very technocratic, and it won't be able to mobilize people in feeling that democracy is a good thing. So this majoritarian element of democracy, of we the people, has to be there at some point, right? And of course, in dangerous times, it can be mobilized by people who will lead societies down dark paths.
Right.
In other times, it can be mobilized for good reasons.
Can you cite an example of a good reason?
Right, it's a great topic. So you can imagine that there is a country out there where elites have indeed managed to win power, and the people are suffering, right?
Plenty of them.
Right, plenty of them. So in those cases, a populist movement would be legitimized, right? Would be a legitimate way to try and tell citizens that they need to do something about it. Specific cases, well, it all has to do with, I guess, your ideological leanings, right? So if you ask a Trump voter today, he will tell you that Trump's populism was a good thing, right? In the past, we've had left-wing populism in the States as well. We've had Huey Long in the 30s, right? We've had even the People's Party or the Populist Party back in the 1890s. You could see that as a left-wing movement. You've had McGovern in the 70s. Many people claimed he was a prairie populist, as they put it, right? And now you have Bernie Sanders, right? For many on the left, Bernie Sanders is a healthy populist element in our political system, right? So the fact that you just claim that we need to do something against those elites in Wall Street or wherever is not necessarily a bad thing. Your judgment should have to do with the actual policy that the party or the movement emphasizes as a solution to the problem. And to be honest, I think that most politicians out there employ a little bit of populism in their discourse. And I should have mentioned that at first. I don't see populism as a black and white thing. It's not like you're either a populist or you're not a populist. And my work is based on that. It's a gradated concept. So all politicians employ populism, right? The question is whether some of them turn that into a dominant theme, which would allow us to call them populists easily, as a shortcut at least.
Right.
But the fact is that populism exists both with good politicians and bad politicians, right?
Okay, well, this has been fascinating. Thank you for clarifying the term populism, because I think it is thrown around and I don't think a lot of people truly understand what it means. So thank you for that and being here with us today and sharing your work.
Thank you very much.
Okay. For more information about Professor Aslanidis and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. Thank you so much.
Thank you.